Okay, so today's daf is Pei Gimel. We're going to start from the Mishnah on the top. So the bones and the sinews and the notar is that leftover meat, the meat that passed its deadline and can no longer be eaten, has to be burnt on the 16th of Nisan. Why not the 15th? Because the 15th is Yom Tov, so you have to leave it till the first day of Chol HaMoed. Obviously, if the 16th of Nisan is Shabbat, then you have to leave it to the 17th. Because we don't, burning of the korbanot, burning of the bones, burning of the notar, doesn't override Shabbat or Yom Tov. It has to be done on Chol. Okay, now of course the Gemara is going to ask the question, why do you have to burn the atzamot? They're not meat. Right? So that's my time. So Amar Rav Mori bar Avua Amar Yitzchak. So Rav Mori bar Avua said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, atzamot kodashim shishimshu notar mitamein et hayadayim whoever nasa basis davar asur, that if you have bones of kodashim, so you have korbanot, and you left the bones of the korbanot past the deadline. Let's say it's a korban that can only be eaten for one day, and you left it past the day. So now it's shimshu notar. What does it mean, shimshu? It means that inside the bone is moach. Is what do you call the stuff inside the
brain?
What do you call it that people like to take out of the inside of the bones? A marrow.
Oh, marrow.
Right. So the marrow is edible. So that becomes notar. It's considered like meat.
Right.
So since this bone is a basis, it's a support for what's inside the marrow inside that's edible. So therefore, it's also considered notar. And if you touch it, you're going to become tameh, because the rabbis decreed tum'ah and notar, on the invalid korban meat, the korban meat that overstays its welcome. Okay, so the bones will also be tameh. Maybe we can see in our Mishnah support for this halacha, because it says hatamot vagidim vanotar yisarful de tetzayin, because it says that the bones and the sinews and the meat that is left over are burnt on the 16th of Nisan. What kind of bones are we dealing with? If we're talking about bones that have no marrow inside, so lama bisrefa nashdinu. Why would you burn the bones? They're not meat. So they're not. You didn't leave over the meat of the in the bones. There's no meat in there. So just throw them away. We must be talking about a case where the bones have something inside, and therefore you have to burn them, because they contain meat that's been left over. Now, if you're going to tell me that the bone, by virtue of the fact that it contains this inside this marrow, and it has this marrow, therefore it's considered to be also notar by extension, that's why it has to be burnt. But if you're going to tell me that the bone itself, just because it contains marrow inside, isn't considered also notar, so lamdu srefa nat birinu v'nehalta lemoachdidu v'nisrefei v'nashtinu ledidu. So he says, why don't we do this then? Tomorrow, in other words, let's take the bones of the Korban Pesach that have moach inside. We're saying the bone itself is not considered like the marrow. Only the marrow inside is considered leftover. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, why don't we just break the bone, extract the marrow and burn that, and leave the bones? Why do we have to burn the bones itself? The bone itself is going to be harder to burn. Mm-hmm. Not easy to burn bone. So why are we burning bone? It must be, we must say then that bones that contain marrow are considered like the marrow itself. And therefore, the bones themselves are an extension of the marrow, and therefore they're also notar, they're also viewed as leftover meat from the korban that was left past its deadline, and therefore you have to burn the bones as well. And this supports the halacha of Rav Mori bar Avua in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, that also the bones would be a source of tum'ah. Right? Now the Gemara says, no, Amri lo. We could say no. We could say that really the bones are not significant. The bones don't have the identity of the notar. But this Tana is holding bo. When it says ve'etzem lo tishbiruvo, you can't break a bone in the Korban Pesach. It doesn't mean just in a kasher, also in a pasul. Meaning, even after. Okay, so here's how it works. Even after the Korban Pesach is already pasul because it's been left past its time, you still can't break a bone in it. Because it says ve'etzem lo tishbiruvo, it's not saying when it's kasher. Even when it's pasul, you can't break a bone in it.
Okay.
That means, so what does that mean? That means you're telling me, why don't I break open the bone? Since the bone itself is not the problem, only what's in the bone is the problem. Why don't I break the bone, extract the moach, extract the, what do we call it again? The marrow, and burn that, and leave the bones. Why do I have to burn the bones? You're telling me to do that. right? But the problem is, no. Even after the korban is over its time, you still can't break the bones of the korban pesach. So that's not an alternative. So since I need to burn
to the marrow,
you can never break the bones of the korban pesach. That's one of the lavim. That's one of the isurim on korban pesach.
Right.
So we can't break the bones and take the marrow out. So even though the bone is not the problem, we still have to burn the whole thing as it is because we can't break it. We're not allowed to break it. Okay? That's what the Gemara is saying. So the Gemara says, you're telling me that even after the Korban Pesach becomes invalid, you're still not allowed to break the bones? But we learned in the Mishnah, we said that somebody who leaves over the Korban Pesach that's tahor doesn't get malkut. He doesn't get whipped. Why not? Because he didn't do an actual action. He didn't do an action. He just failed to do. And if he breaks the bones of a tameh korban pesach, he also doesn't get malkut. So seemingly that means that an invalid korban pesach isn't subject to the rule that you can't break the bones. So you could break the bones.
What's that logic again?
Which logic? The Gemara is now dealing with when the korban becomes invalid, can you break the bones now?
Right.
So the question is, if you can't break the bones, then we understand why you have to burn the bones, because the bones have marrow inside.
Right.
But if you could break the bones, then we don't understand why you have to burn the bones. Just extract the marrow from inside. Now this Korban Pesach passed its time already, so it's invalid. So the Gemara first suggested maybe you can't break the bones of the Korban Pesach even after its deadline. Even after, you can never break the bones ever. So now the Gemara is saying, no, it's not true, because it says that a tamei korban pesach, if you broke the bone, you're not gonna be in trouble for that. So that means you could have broken the bones. So the question comes back, why don't we say that you can break the bones and just burn what's inside? Why are we saying that you have to burn the bones? So lo kashya. Kan shahita lo shata kosher. Kan shelo haita lo shata kosher. It depends. One case is talking about where it had shata kosher. It had a time that it was valid. And one is talking about where it never had a time that it was valid. In other words, when it never had a time when it was valid. In other words, it was invalid from the get-go. From the very beginning, it was invalid.
With the bone,
it became tameh from the beginning. It never had a time that it was kasher.
The rest.
The whole thing. Let's say the whole thing became tameh. So when the whole thing became tameh, so then then you can break the bone. But when it was good at some point, in other words, it started out valid and it became invalid. It became tameh. Since at one point the prohibition of breaking the bone was in effect, because it had a shata kosher. We had this yesterday. It had a moment where it was valid. So therefore, it's always going to have that.
Right.
So we're back to our answer of before. Okay, we're saying, why do you have to burn the bones? Why can't you just break the bones and take the marrow out? Oh, because since this was a valid korban at one point, even though now it passed its deadline, you still can never break the bones. That Mishnah that you told me is talking about a case where it was tameh from the beginning. That's why you're allowed. That's why if you broke the bones, you're not liable, because it was never valid.
So they're arguing if you take out the marrow, then you would not have to burn the bone itself.
That's what they're arguing about.
Because the bone would not be tameh if you took the marrow out.
What's the tameh have to do with it?
Or what? Why?
Okay, let's review one more time what the main issue is. Okay, that we started out with the question like this: if there's marrow inside the bone, is the bone itself considered like an extension of what's inside it, or is the bone looked at separately?
In other words, if it did not...
that's question number one.
If it did not have marrow in it...
then we wouldn't even be talking.
So what status would it have? It would be...
We're not talking about tameh. That's why I'm trying to rewind. Okay? It's really talking about...
to burn it.
Right.
Because
it doesn't have any meat. You only have to burn the meat that's left over. Only the edible things.
Oh, okay. That's it.
Right?
Okay.
So the question was, what about the bone? Since it's serving what's inside, and what's inside is edible.
Is that okay?
Okay. So the Gemara is saying, no, it's... So first the Gemara was saying, yeah, you see that the bones are really an extension of the marrow.
Okay.
Because you have to burn the bones. And the Gemara said, no, that's just because you can't break the bones.
Right.
You really just have to burn the marrow, but you can't break the bones. So then the Gemara said, wait, but these bones are from a korban that already passed its deadline. And once a korban passed its deadline, you're allowed to break the bones.
Right.
Because it's no longer valid. Then the Gemara said, no, that's only true when this korban never was valid. But if it was valid and became invalid, like our case, it was valid and then the time period passed, then you're not allowed to break the bones. That's why we're burning all the bones. Not because the bones are like meat. Not because the bones are like meat. Okay, so now the Gemara says, who is the one who distinguishes between a case where the korban was initially valid and became invalid versus where it was always invalid? Rabbi Yaakov, it's Rabbi Yaakov. The Tanya says in the Braita, it says you can't break a bone in the korban Pesach. That means, according to the Tanna Kama, you only are prohibited from breaking the bone of the korban Pesach when it is a valid one. Rabbi Yaakov Omer, Hayta lo shata kosher v'nifsal, yesh bo mishum shivirat ha'etzem. Lo hayta lo shata kosher, in bo mishum shivirat ha'etzem. So according to Rabbi Yaakov, it goes like this. It doesn't matter the status of the korban right now, valid or invalid. What matters is, was it ever valid? Right? That's what we're saying here. If it was valid, and then later became tamei, or later got left over, so that prohibition of breaking its bones stays in force forever. If, before you even offered it, became tamei, before you completed the offering, it already became tamei. So then, there's no prohibition on breaking the bone because it never had a moment that it was valid. The Tanna Kama is saying we only look at it right now. We say, is it valid or invalid right now? Invalid? Break the bone if you want. Valid? Don't break the bone. Rabbi Yaakov is saying, even if it's invalid right now, it's tamei or it was left over, the reality is it once was good. And since it once was good, it never goes back to being permitted to break its bones. The Isur on the bone stays forever. Okay, so what do we say? Rabbi Shimon Omer, and according to Rabbi Shimon, he says, no, it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter. As long as right now it's invalid forever. As long as right now it's invalid, that means you can break the bones. But what's the point? That according to Rabbi Yaakov, we distinguish, and so the Gemara is going with Rabbi Yaakov. He distinguishes between when it was initially valid and became invalid versus when it was always invalid. And since here we're talking about a case where what? It was initially a good korban. You left over these bones past the deadline of eating the korban Pesach, and you can't ever break the bones. You're not ever allowed to because it was once a valid korban, so that's why you have to burn the entire bones. Makes sense, right? There is an objection. All bones of kodashim do not require burning, except for the bones of the korban Pesach, because of the takala, because of the danger. What is the danger? What's the takala that we're talking about here? So Rashi, where does Rashi explain it? He says, because we're worried that you're going to end up breaking the bones, right? Because he says, here it is. It's not on takala. He says, he says, what's the reason? So he says, we burn them because of the danger that a person might break them. Okay, the other ones we don't have to worry. These we have to worry that a person's going to break them, so we burn them. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Hani atzamot hechidami, what kind of bones are we talking about here? If we're talking about a case where it doesn't have any of the marrow inside.
That's what I was
saying. So why do you have to burn it? We're talking about where it does have. And if you're going to tell me that any bone that contains marrow, the bone itself is considered to be like the marrow, so then atzamot kodashim amai into an insrefa. So why don't you have to burn also the bones of the other korbanot? Because once they're left over past their deadline, they also require burning.
And not just the bone, like the hair and there are a lot of...
Well, no, we understand why only the bone does, because the bone has something edible inside, right?
But the hair, there is no question. Like
the hair is not edible; it's not part of the meat, so we're not going to be concerned about that.
And that has no need to be.
Right, that you don't have to burn. But here we have something inside that is edible. So the question is, okay, that's good. So you can't break the Pesach's bones, so you have to burn the bones. But why don't you have to burn the other kodashim? That's the question. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, what are we talking about over here? Kigon shemitzaan chalutzin. This is talking about a case where you found them chalutzin, which means to say that you found them broken already and the marrow spilled out already. So kodashim de'en bahen mishum shvirat ha'etzem. When it comes to other korbanot, that there's no prohibition of breaking the bones. Kamed de'nahavu notar chaltzinu. We're going to assume that it was before they became invalid that the bones were broken. In other words, the marrow was extracted from these bones while they were being eaten in the normal way, and that makes sense that it would be that way, because since we're dealing with korbanot where you're allowed to break the bones, any other korbanot you're allowed to break the bones. That's how it should be. However, when it comes to atzamot pesach, but when it comes to the korban pesach, when you find broken bones, what are you going to assume about these broken bones? You're going to assume that the broken bones were broken after they became notar, after they were left past their deadline, and therefore they were broken because they were, in this opinion, right, in this view, allowed to be broken after they became invalid. Right? And so therefore, what do we say? And therefore, as Rashi explains, so you have the bones then served the notar. What is that? Why did they serve the notar? Because you waited until they were notar already before you broke them and took out the marrow. Whereas with the other kodashim, you didn't wait for the marrow inside to become notar before you broke the bones. You were allowed to break the bones before. Right. So we assume that these bones never actually served the marrow, so they're not considered an extension of the marrow. But in the case of Korban Pesach, we assume that the bones contained the marrow when it became notar, and then you broke them. So therefore the bones themselves have to be burnt. So what does that show you? That the bones are also considered an extension of the marrow if they serve the marrow. Okay, that's the way that Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak explains it. Rav Zvid says no. Here's the difference between regular korbanot and korban pesach. We're talking about a case We're talking about a case where you found them tzavurin, you found them in a pile. Umehen halutzin, and some of them are broken. They were
taken out of the animal already.
Right, so you find a pile of bones, right? So he says like this: when it comes to the atzamot kodashim, you see a pile of bones of other korbanot. So you see that the top ones, Rashi explains, you see the top ones are broken and there's no marrow inside. So what can you assume about the rest of the pile? Probably they sucked the marrow out of all of these bones because you're allowed to.
Right.
But when you're eating it.
Right.
So you don't have to burn any of that. But Korban Pesach, if you find on the top that there are a few bones that are broken and the marrow has been taken out, that doesn't mean that the rest of them are broken. Because maybe the rest of them, nobody broke them. Because you're not allowed to break them. You're only allowed to break them when what's inside is already prohibited anyway.
You have to be sure for the entire thing. Right. Every single one.
Right, so Rashi explains that Ubaha Palig Rav Zvid ad Rav Nachman. Rav Zvid is arguing with Rav Nachman. Imatan chalutzin lo hamir shimush notar kolei latzrichos refa misafek v'lomar batar Yisrael chaltzinu. So Rav Zvid is arguing with Rav Nachman. Okay, because Rav Nachman was talking about a case where you found the bones already cleared out of the marrow, and you're still worried that maybe the bones served the marrow at some point. He's saying, no, we're not worried about that, but when you find some that are broken and the marrow has been taken out, the question is, what do you assume about the rest of them? Do you assume that they still contain the marrow, and you have to check, or not? So with the other kodashim, we assume that they've all been drained of the marrow. In the case of Pesach, we assume that they still contain it, and therefore we have to burn all of them. Okay, so Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Kol Gidin Basar Chutz Migdei Tzavar. All gidin, all sinews are considered like meat. People eat sinew, except for the sinews of the neck. They're very thick. They're like a piece of wood. Okay? Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, that it said that when it comes to bones and sinews and leftover meat from the Korban Pesach, you burned it on the 16th of Nisan. What kind of sinews are we talking about here? If we're talking about the sinews that are edible, why were they not eaten? And if they were left over, then they're also notar. In other words, they're meat. Sinews are meat, you're telling me. However, so you must be talking about the sinews of the neck. But if that's the case, so you have a contradiction here. Because on one, if you're going to tell me that you're telling me that all sinews are meat, except for the sinews of the neck. All right. So if all sinews are meat, then that means that there's no reason for the Mishnah to mention sinews separately. If it's talking about the edible ones, they're meat. And if it's talking about the inedible ones of the neck, why do you have to burn them? They're not part of the edible part. Right? It's a contradiction. So Rav Chisda says we're talking about the Gid Hanasheh. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanya, it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no hegel b'achat v'adat machra'at shel yamin. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, so the gid hanasheh is on both sides of the animal, right? Both sides have the sciatic nerve in the back. So Rabbi Yehuda has an opinion that only the right side is prohibited. The left side, you want the gid hanasheh from the left side? It's fine. That's why he says only one of them. V'adat machra'at. And the intellect decides that it's probably the right side. Now, in the Gemara, right? So in the Gemara, there's in the Gemara there where that's the main sugya. It discusses: does he mean that it's definitely the right one, or that he's not sure? Right? The hadat machrat means I think, I'm pretty sure, or does he mean that it's definite? Right? So now the Gemara says, so you can see from here that Rabbi Yehuda is in doubt. Why? Because the Rabbi Yehuda, because if he were sure that the right side gid hanasheh is treif, right? You're not allowed to eat it. And the left side gid hanasheh is kasher. So then what should you do? Throw out the one that's prohibited. It's not notar. You don't have to burn it. It wasn't edible. And the one that is edible, eat it. The left side, eat it. Okay, so
where does that come from?
Lama lesrefa. So why do you have to burn it?
There is no.
So what he's saying is like this.
Right and left.
I don't know. So you have to ask Rabbi Yehuda what he's saying. No, so since Rabbi Yehuda holds that only one of them is prohibited, so for him there's a sinew, in other words, that's edible.
Yeah.
And there, in other words, there's a sinew that's edible that isn't in the neck, but that isn't exactly part of the flesh. So basically what he's saying is like this, that it's a doubt which one it is, right? We're not sure if the right side gid hanasheh or the left side, because if we knew for sure that the right side is prohibited and the left side is permitted, then we would say the right side goes with everything else that's burnt, all the other pieces that are inedible, and the left side, eat it. So the fact that it says that you have to burn the gid hanasheh, okay, in other words, the fact that...
The Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara doesn't say you have to burn the gid hanasheh. It says you have to burn the sinews.
The Mishnah says you have to burn the sinews, and it's saying if it's talking about the inedible ones, obviously. If it's talking about the meat, it's part of the meat. Yeah. So you have something that's neither in the category of meat, meaning you can't eat it, nor is it in the category of other sinews that it's inedible.
No, but gid hanasheh could be edible. It's just prohibited to eat. You're not.
It's physically edible, but it's not halachically edible.
Exactly.
That's the point, but he's saying since we don't know which one is halachically, since according to Rabbi Yehuda one of them really is edible, even halachically, we just don't know which.
Yeah.
So we have to burn them. Because if we knew which one, we would say eat one, throw away the other.
He's bringing as a comparison, or is saying that this is actually what the Gemara is saying?
He's saying that the Mishnah must be talking according to Rabbi Yehuda, because otherwise, why does it have to mention burning the gidim? The gidim are either totally inedible or they are part of the meat.
Right.
So why would you have to burn them?
Okay.
Why would there be a special halacha of burning them? So it's like, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to burn the gid hanasheh because you don't know which one is the right one. Amar Rabbi Ika barachinena. You don't have to say that. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, it could be that Rabbi Yehuda is certain that only the right side, gid hanasheh, is not kosher. It could be he's certain about it. You're trying to say, he must be in doubt. Why is he in doubt? Because he's telling you to burn it. And so he doesn't know which one. Right? Mm-hmm. They say, no, that's not true. It's not true. Really, he's certain that it's the right one that's not allowed and the left one that's allowed. The only problem is we're talking about where they got mixed up together. You can't remember which is which. That's why you have to burn it. Maybe what our Mishnah is talking about is not the gid hanasheh itself, but shamnoshel gid. In other words, the fat around the gid hanasheh, which is only a surmi the Rabbanan. That the fat around the gid hanasheh is permitted from the Torah. But Yisrael are kedoshim. Yisrael kedoshim. They're holy. They don't eat it. So what does that mean? That means that really min haTorah, it's considered meat. And when you leave it over, it's considered notar, considered leftover. Correct? But we don't eat it. We don't eat it as a minhag, as a chumrah. So that's what when the Mishnah says burn the gidim, it means burn the fat of the gid hanasheh, which is neither meat in the sense that it can't be eaten, nor is it sinew in the sense that it wouldn't be subject to the prohibition of leaving it over. Because really, you should have eaten it. Right? From the perspective of Korban Pesach, since you're supposed to consume the whole thing, but we don't eat that part. So now, one more possibility. Ravina Amar b'chitzon uke de Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Da Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, bet gidin hen, pnimi asamuch le'etzem, asur b'chayvin alav, chitzon asamuch le'basar, asur ben chayvin alav. He says that there are actually two gidim, there are two sinews on the leg of the animal. One is vertical, and that's the gid hanasheh. The other one's horizontal, and it's closer to the skin, further from the bone. The gid hanasheh is attached tightly to the bone. So it's talking about that sinew, the sinew that is not the gid hanasheh, but is near the gid hanasheh. And that's why it's saying that you have to burn. It's not considered meat, but it's also not considered to be an inedible thing. So so what does Rashi say? Does Rashi explain it? He says the short one. One second. Right, so he says that the chitzon, this outer sinew, okay, it's asur midrabanan also, because it could be confused with the gid hanasheh ostensibly, that's the reason, right? And so what will happen? So you have the same problem that you have with the shamno shel gid, the same problem that you have with the fat of the gid hanasheh, which is it's really only asur midrabanan. So from the Torah's perspective, what happens here? That's considered the meat of the Korban Pesach. You're not supposed to leave it over. From the perspective of us, we don't eat that midrabanan. So you can't tell the person to eat it. So it's not really in the category of notar, or the part you could eat. It's not really in the category of gidim that are inedible. So you have to burn it, even though it is edible. So it's in a separate category, and that's what the Mishnah was referring to, this third category of things that are neither meat that was left over out of negligence, nor are they inedible parts. Okay, now the Gemara says...
Gosh, this is a perfect example of the Gemara trying to bring something in to clarify something, and
which is totally out of a hat, completely random.
Confuses the whole thing. Like where where in the beginning we would see like a little bit of a direction where we would go. This is like now I'm totally confused.
Right, because basically they were so bothered by the superfluous word of gidim.
But they made it even more superfluous now.
That they're trying to say that it's going to teach you
something specific,
some additional halacha, right?
Yeah.
So now Chal Tetzain. So it said that if the Tetzain, if the 16th of Nisan falls on Shabbat, so we can't burn Kodashim on Shabbat. So it says Vamai Neti Aseh V'Didchi Lo Taseh. Why can't you burn the Korban on Shabbat or Yom Tov? Why can't the positive mitzvah of burning the notar override the negative commandment? So Amar Chizkiah v'chein Tanit Devei Chizkiah said in his yeshiva taught Amar Kra, the pasuk says Lo Tazor Mimenu Ad Boker V'Anotar Mimenu Ad Boker B'Ish Tisrofu. It says don't leave over the Korban Pesach until the morning. V'Anotar Mimenu Ad Boker, and anything you leave over till the morning B'Ish Tisrofu. So why does it say Ad Boker twice? She'en Talmud Amar Ad Boker. Why does it have to say twice? Ma Talmud Amar Ad Boker Litein Lo Boker Sheni L'Sreifato, to teach you. What might you think? You might think, tonight is the night of Pesach. We have the seder. We left over a piece of meat. Now in the morning it is notar, left over. So you might think it says, whatever you left over to the morning, burn it on Yom Tov. Because the morning is Yom Tov. So that's why it says Ad Boker twice, meaning you have to wait till the next morning, till Chol HaMoed, not the first day of Yom Tov, to burn it. So that's where we learn that you can't burn the Kodashim on Yom Tov or Shabbat. Abaye Amar Kra Olat Shabbat B'Shabbato V'lo Olat Chol B'Shabbat V'lo Olat Chol B'Yom Tov. Abaye said, it says in the pasuk, Olat Shabbat b'Shabbato, the offering of Shabbat on its Shabbat, and not the offering of Chol on Shabbat, and not the offering of Chol on Yom Tov. So Rashi explains here, what does Chol have to do with this? This is not Chol, right? So he says, Alma afilu ekder ola enodocha Yom Tov, v'kol shkein tzrifat pasul shala. So what that shows you is that the burning of an olah, the burning of some kind of korban, doesn't override Yom Tov, and certainly not burning an invalid korban. Okay? So, therefore, what do we say here? Same thing. You can't burn an invalid korban. It's not a mitzvah right now. There's no urgent mitzvah that it's part of the Shabbat to burn this korban, or it's part of the Yom Tov to burn this korban, so you can't do it.
Yeah, right.
Okay? That's how Abai learns it.
It's not an obligation.
Right. So, Rava Amar Kra, hu levado yaseh lechem, hu v'lo machshirav, levado v'lo milah shelo bizmana, haba mikal v'chomer. Rava says that we have a pasuk, this alone may you do for yourselves, meaning you can only do things that are for food on Yom Tov, only melachot that are for food. Hu v'lo machshirav, this alone meaning not machshirav. Machshirav, as we learned in Masechet Shabbat, refers to, for example, a person wants to make a knife to work with food, or make an oven. Okay, it connects to food, but it's machshirim. It is a a prerequisite of cooking. It's not cooking itself. And and livado alone, velo milah shel bezmana. Haba b'kal v'chomer, because there's a kal v'chomer. Rashi explains the kal v'chomer, which is actually mentioned in Masechet Shabbat, that there's a kal v'chomer that seemingly would prove that you could do a milah shelo bezmana and Yom Tov. Meaning a milah that was pushed off.
Oh, I think I remember.
Remember that? Yeah. So the argument was tzara'at overrides the avodah, because if the kohen has tzara'at, he can't do the avodah, and avodah overrides Shabbat.
Right.
Right? Because we know that we bring korbanot and we slaughter and we cook korbanot on Shabbat. Right. So that means that tzara'at is more important than avodah. Avodah is more important than Shabbat. So if we're making a hierarchy, we would say that tzara'at is more important than Shabbat, because it's more, right? Because if it can push off avodah, which itself can push off Shabbat, and then comes along Brit Milah overrides tzara'at.
Right. So
because Brit Milah, even if it's pushed off, even if the baby is not being nimol on the 8th day, he's being nimol on the 25th day, it doesn't matter. Still, if he has tzara'at in the area of the milah, and by cutting the Brit Milah, you're going to be cutting off a piece of tzara'at, it's okay. Overrides the prohibition. So what do you see? Milah should override. Even shelo bizmana. Even when you're doing a Brit Milah that's not on the 8th day, it should override Shabbat and Yom Tov. Because if it overrides tzara'at overrides avodah overrides Shabbat and Yom Tov, so kavachomer. So it says, therefore the word livado comes to teach you that that's not the case. In other words, we need a special pasuk to exclude milah shelo bizmana from happening on Yom Tov and Shabbat. Okay, so therefore, and similarly, it excludes burning, as Rashi explains. He says, "V'gabe srifat pesul kodashim nami kamilah shelo bizmana defshad shahuye dami." And it's similar. Burning the invalid korbanot is similar, Rashi says, to the Brit Milah in its improper time, the delayed Brit Milah, because both of them could be done later. What's the rush? It's not a mitzvah to do it right now. So therefore, it doesn't override the day. Last explanation. Rav Ashi Amar Shabbaton diyom tov asehu ve'en aseh doche lo taseh ve'aseh. This is the answer that's most often brought in the Sifrei Halacha. Namely, that yes, it's true that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah, but that's only the case when it's overriding a simple negative commandment. But when you have a positive and negative, for example, Shabbat is a positive commandment, Tishbot, as well as Lo Taseh Malacha. Yom Tov is Shabbaton, meaning it's a positive commandment to rest on Yom Tov, and a negative. So actually, the one positive of burning the Kodashim, burning the Notar, or doing the Brit Milah or whatever, is going against a positive and negative. Not just a negative. Because it's not just don't do Malacha on Shabbat. It's don't do Malacha on Shabbat and rest on Shabbat. It's a positive and negative. Okay. And you're saying the positive mitzvah of burning the Kodashim should override a negative. That's true. If it were just the negative, that would be true, but it's also overriding a positive.
That's interesting.
Because Shabbat has also a positive. That's what the Rambam brings as the reason, if I remember correctly, that since Shabbat and Yom Tov are a positive and a negative, they're not just a negative commandment. Yeah. That's why positive mitzvot don't override Shabbat.
Right.
Why doesn't lulav override Shabbat? Why don't any of these things? It doesn't. That doesn't involve a malacha. But why can't other positive mitzvot override Shabbat? The reason is because it's overriding not just the negative of not doing malacha, it's overriding a positive and a negative. So you can't really say. In other words, it's even. No, the opposite. Shabbat is stronger because Shabbat is already a positive and negative. So why should just a positive override a positive and negative?
So you say you would not override.
You wouldn't override.
You would not override because it overrides.
Because Shabbat is stronger. It's 2. It's overriding 2.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
It's 2 against 1. So therefore it doesn't override. Right. And that's why you can't burn the invalid Kodashim on Shabbat or Yom Tov, because that would involve overriding a positive and negative for the sake of just the positive, and that we're not going to do.
For one.
And that we're not going to do. And that's the conclusion of the sugya.